Welcome everyone to this year's launch of State of the Newsroom. It's an annual publication by the Wits Centre for Journalism. And I believe this issue will be shared online with you or shared very shortly in the chat. This State of the Newsroom report covers two main areas: job losses in the news media sector and the challenges journalists faced in the coverage of the national and provincial elections in May. It comes at a time when things don't look that good for news media in this country. Print newspapers appear finally to be on their way out. Internet news is battling the theft of advertising revenue from the big tech platforms. TV news is struggling. And a snapshot survey we did for this State of the Newsroom hints that radio news is also not doing that well. In this issue, Gillian Jones also points out that financial journalism, which I would have assumed was the easiest form of journalism to sell, is also against the ropes. What does this mean for the future of public interest journalism in this country and the role and capacity of journalists in holding power to account? To discuss these issues and other issues, we have four guests with us in this 1 hour seminar, all of whom contributed to this issue of State of the Newsroom. Conita Hunter, an award-winning political journalist and author; Mamaponya Mutsai, the CEO of Frey College; Glenda Daniels, who is an associate professor and head of the Department of Media Studies at Wits University; and Anthea Garman, who is a professor of journalism at the Rhodes School of Journalism and Media Studies. Welcome to you all. Glenda, if I could start with you. You worked on the snapshot survey for this issue of State of the Newsroom. A diverse basket of 29 newsrooms responded: commercial, community, radio, TV, print, and independent newsrooms. What findings interested you the most about the survey?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me. So, more than the findings, I just want to take one step backwards into what stood out for me is that, as like 10 years ago, but maybe more pronounced now than ever before, the issue of the definition of who and what a journalist is today is not being sorted. And mind you, it's not going to happen in the digital and social media age, because that is exactly what we are in. It's not good. We're not going to have strict definitions of this is a journalist and this is not a journalist. So that is the one thing that stood out for me. Another thing is there's a bit of a swings and a roundabout situation where, yes, we've lost on mainstream, but most certainly there have been gains on online journalism, in online journalism, and a little bit of gain in the public broadcaster scenario. However, I'm not sure with the SABC if they're actually adding on the contract workers. So that's another area where we don't know for sure if in the past, when I did the first State of the Newsroom, that was also an area of contention. Was it actually 700 or was it actually 300? Because in fact, the majority of people who were employed at the SABC were there on tenuous gig type contracts. So those are the two or three things that stood out. Who knows whether there is actually mainstream consolidation. Certainly, if that was the case, that's a pity, because we lose in terms of diversity of voice and plurality. But we are actually dealing in a very open, fluid situation right now with regard to how many job losses there are, and what kind of strict definitions some researchers would use. And certainly with us, when we did the snapshot survey, we went broad. We said sub-editors and photographers as well. That's all for now. I'll talk a little bit more later. I'm sure you have other
Yeah.
questions.
I mean, you do raise the very interesting point about the sort of diversity of journalism jobs. I noticed, I think it was yesterday, that UNESCO released a survey of influencers in Asia, and I think in one other region of the world. And they've embarked on a capacity building, journalism capacity building course for influencers, because apparently influencers don't identify as doing the work of journalists. Anthea, if I could come to you, I mean, this is kind of the issue that you raise in your commentary piece about what do journalism schools do now? What are they actually doing, and who are they actually training, and for what kind of future?
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. And it was lovely to read the State of Newsroom report. I think it does very good work for us in kind of creating these benchmarks every single year. So I suppose I've started to sort of think of myself as a stealth journalism teacher, because, you know, regardless of the fact of whether those formal newsrooms exist and those, you know, hierarchies and those positions and that flow work in the same way or not, the fact is that we've seen such a proliferation of appalling types of information that have dreadful effects in our world, that actually, you know, now more than ever, we need journalism's particular kinds of techniques of verification, of hearing all voices, of not taking, you know, some authority's voice as an absolute given, you know, being suspicious about who in power has, reasons to manipulate information. We really live in a world in which, you know, I suppose, as we've never seen before, the plethora of variety of types of information just, you know, deluges us a lot. So weirdly, you know, it's not in the hands of journalists any longer to kind of, you know, insert these controls and these methods of sifting. But if we're dealing with, you know, we've got a very big intake this year. 350 first years started off the year with us, which means, you know, at the other end, you know, how many will be walking out into media jobs? And I look across the universities and think there are multiple journalism programs, not just ours. So they will go. You know, they won't land up in traditional newsrooms and maybe not even in news. But I do think that if they take that understanding, that commitment, and that spirit with them, then they'll infuse it. And I had two experiences just in the last month of students who've left us like 5 years ago, coming back to say hello. And you sort of find this person wandering the corridors looking for people they once knew. And you got to say, oh, who are you? Where'd you come from? You know, and then you discover that, you know, they went through our journalism courses, but they're not journalists at all. The one is working for a very exciting international NGO, which has got accreditation with the UN, and the other one's working in kind of advertising, media product stuff. But the interesting thing is, you know, I sort of seized the opportunity to say to both of them, well, did we do you any good? You know, are you using the skills we gave you? Because it's uppermost in my mind. And both of them say emphatically yes. You know, it really is a great advantage to have that journalism, that little package of whatever that thing is that makes journalism distinct from other kinds of information. It's very, very valuable. So it sort of reinforces that thought for me, that we can't, while we see that weird sort of proliferation of strange situations, you know, and different type ways of making information, actually this thing still has value and we should hold on to it.
An interesting thing from our snapshot survey that we did, a couple of things. There were youth publications that responded saying they ran newsrooms. There's a new agricultural publication, um, uh, you know, where journalists can go work in a newsroom, and actually they're hiring at the moment. I mean, it reminds me that, in fact, if you look back at least some issues of Farmers Weekly, they were doing some incredible evidence-based reporting, which aren't usually seen as newsrooms or the job of journalism. Um, Glenda, this diversity issue, we called them others. You know, we had to find a new category for them, even, you know, because we got our community, we got our this and that, we've got our startups, and then we've got our donor funded, and we've got these others. Um, is that the future, Glenda? Do you think of journalism that smaller newsrooms, much more diverse, um, with, you know, maybe some sort of consolidated central commercial newsroom, which doesn't sound that great. Anyway, I mean, what do you make of that? The diversity of the newsrooms that responded to our survey.
Look, Alan, on the one hand, it does look like it is the future, but as Anthea was just pointing out, then the future also looks quite bleak because there's going to be no stop to disinformation, fake news, malinformation. It is actually what exists right now. And it feels like mainstream journalism is on the back foot because not everyone belongs to the press council. Not everyone who would call themselves a journalist would subscribe to the codes of ethics. Now, all those things are actually serious problems that we're dealing with right now. So, as much as we should be welcoming otherness and diversity and plurality, we also have to worry about the public. And some people will say that's a very mainstream conservative view of, a gatekeeping view. On the other hand, if one didn't have that, then it would be a free for all, which actually exists today in South Africa and in the world, a free for all of content creators where everyone's making things and putting it out there. And then, some people would say this one is okay and that one is not okay. And so, we increasingly in a space of polarization and binary oppositions because of this kind of thing. And then we find it impacts on the public because the middle ground or democracy is being squeezed out, and we're getting these polar opposites, which is mirrored in the world in terms of authoritarianism and warlike people, etc. So it is quite a mess. And I would still subscribe to, just recently or the other day, 2 days ago, or was it yesterday? Yesterday, it was Tuesday, that a fund was launched. 114 million rand was given from Google to community media. And a lot of community media was saying, now, will you make sure this is an ongoing thing for media? And a lot of people were saying this is to kickstart the fact that media collapsed. It's not to keep giving handouts to people. So even in that area of who's going to get these grants, who's going to get 1 million here and 1 million there, it all boils down to who is doing credible journalism. What is journalism actually all about today? Those are questions I can't actually answer because nobody's actually answered that question either. But, I would subscribe to the fact that we do need to take the codes of ethics extremely seriously, and people need to subscribe to the co-regulation system that we have, whether it's a one-person show or two-person show in a newsroom. That would be my criteria for journalism and whatever kind of otherness that's being used to platform the journalists. It doesn't really matter, whether it's a journalist who's doing journalism on TikTok or on YouTube. It can still be journalism, actually.
Sorry, I'm just unclicking my mic. And thanks, Glenda. Anthea, that reminds me, there was a declaration, right, at Rhodes University recently around public interest journalism. Can you briefly, were you involved in that? Can you briefly just tell us something about that?
I was involved in it, and it has, I think, 11 principles, and I can't remember them all. But I think what we were trying to do was to separate out public journalism for the public good, journalism as a public good. And this, of course, arises, from all these fights with Google and Facebook, sucking up the advertising revenue. And then these arguments that something must be saved. Well, what is it that must be saved, So that was partly what we did in April, was we had a sort of smallish conference in which that was one of the focuses. There were some others, like the digital and AI and like, the safety of journalists, which you also focused on in the State of the Newsroom report. But I think that while we've talked up to this point about journalism as a practice still has value in the world, the blurriness of the situation means we no longer have that sort of very clear sense of these are the journalists and this is the kind of things they practice. And, these are ethical and these are principled and so on and so on. So that, that was a lot the debate, is that if you're going to save something, it's obviously got to have value. It's got to have value for the public. It's got to have value for democracy. And then what exactly is the journalism that does that work? And we can't take that for granted anymore, because, we might have at one point gone, well, generally, while, newspapers and television and radio were commercial, that was their intention and they were kind of guided by that. It's not so much the case any longer with this proliferation of different outlets. But I suppose it would have to be, it's got to have a certain kind of hallmark. It's got to be ethical. It must abide by certain kinds of principles. It must have as its focus the good of a society. It must be democratically minded. Then that's journalism as a public good. Other kind of journalism, we can talk about it in debate, but that's an ongoing conversation, and comes up again and again in these kind of arguments about, who gets financial, bolstering in order to continue doing this kind of journalism. So it's a very heated subject.
Yeah, and I suppose it makes me think of perhaps not such an issue in South Africa, but certainly in the UK with the sort of gutter press, and that are they doing journalism even though they would be counted as newsrooms, Mama Ponya, if I might turn to you, I mean, some of these issues you touch on about the value of journalism and sustainability you're mostly concerned with commercial, but also community, I guess, newsrooms, the more formal newsrooms that we consider. Your article deals with issues of sustainability, gives a sort of overview of some of the pressure points and how newsrooms can think perhaps more creatively about trying to make money. Can you briefly share some of your key observations with us?
Thanks, Alan. So my article was written based on research we did with Bloomberg, which is about financial sustainability, or generally about the state of media across Africa, but has a huge focus on financial sustainability. And also part of that was because when we were speaking to journalists and editors and publishers across the continent, one of the first questions we'd ask is, what are the pressing issues in the media right now? And without a doubt, all of them said finances, financial sustainability. We are on our knees. So that's and I mean, we've been seeing it for years now. And I think now we are just seeing just how deep it is. So the section I wrote really focuses on that. And one of the things that also came out from the research was that although there is this huge crisis, if you are moving in the circles where you're mainly dealing with mainstream media, the big media organizations, there's a lot of talk about innovating, about diversifying, but once you begin to include other media, the smaller ones, the local ones, we found that there isn't. Many news organizations are not diversifying. They're not thinking about, okay, what's happening with the digital disruption and how are we adapting to that? So they are just crippled by the changes, but not really knowing what to do. So, but the other thing that we also found is that even those who are experimenting and diversifying and doing this and that, one of the main findings was that it's just not enough. What we have right now is not enough. We are all still trying to find what can work in terms of being financially sustainable. I remember that when I was writing the piece, I think in there it says something like Daily Maverick has been doing really well and hasn't had any retrenchments. But just a few weeks ago, they announced that they will be having a round of retrenchments. And from the outside eye, given how innovative Daily Maverick has been and all the things that they've been doing, you would say they're doing excellently. But here we are, and actually, in some of the interviews we did with Daily Maverick, and in the interviews that they did with the Competition Commission earlier this year, one of the things that their leaderships keep reiterating is that the situation is so dire, and many would agree with this, that if things do not change in 5 years' time, the only media organizations that will be able to open their doors are those supported by government. So that's how bad things are. And that's how much we really need to come together as different sectors and different industries to find out how do we support our media, especially when we are talking about public interest media.
I mean, you raise an interesting point of how I suppose we assume that, I mean, economies and sectors, devolve as much as they evolve. And I suppose sort of a devolution would be to, sort of starting to look more like an authoritarian state with government-funded media, as we see in other countries around the world, that I suppose we have an assumption that wouldn't happen in South Africa. So it's quite a warning sign when you suggest that that could be the case. Um, Glenda effectively, I mean, there is this issue of structural support, donor-funded newsrooms, and people say, well, what does that mean, and so on. I personally am a strong supporter of donor-funded newsrooms as a way of financing, despite there might be some sort of political issues involved. Glenda mentioned Google. You also raised this issue of financial support, and you do mention a couple of state-funded supports. I mean, just could you elaborate on some of the ideas? For instance, you had an interesting one around using proceeds from a specialized investigative unit.
Yeah, it goes back to the idea that if this is public interest journalism, and it is building our democracy, and the country would fall apart without it. And we know that without good journalism, and without the kind of news that is highlighted by investigative journalism and just everyday work that journalists do to keep citizens informed, democracy would crumble. So if that is the case, and we often refer to journalism as the fourth estate, and even though it's not officially so, there should be talks around, if it is the fourth estate, if it is such an important sector, how do we put in place measures? We can think about how we put these kind of things into place, but we do need to have conversations around how can different sectors, including government, can also come to help. The new fund that was announced for AIP by Google, and they also announced how they will make sure that there's transparency from the very beginning when people apply, all the way to when people get grants, and the reporting around that, and who gets to administer this fund. Things like that can also be, the same can be done by through government money as well. It's not so much that it's impossible because it's government money, but it's how do we make sure that because government is also helping, it does not feel like it can dictate what stories are being published. But I think we are at that point where we need to say, okay, if we're saving the public, then how do we get that kind of money also to help our journalists and our journalism? And I think, again, it's not just government that needs to come on board. The private sector needs to come on board. Our communities need to come on board. I mean, a few weeks ago on Twitter, there was a certain businessman whose business was being liquidated, and some community, just normal people and business people and politicians were saying, what can we do to help? They were tagging influential people. They were tagging to say, what can we do to help? And we need to start thinking about how do we get that kind of collaboration, even from our community and our public, so that the project of saving the media and making media journalism financial sustainability does not just rest on the shoulders of the newsroom, but even the people that are served and the different communities also feel a certain level of responsibility. And that is what will also create more transparency when it just doesn't belong to one or two people, but it belongs to all of us. And that's a huge task, given also the levels of mistrust between media and some communities, including government, but also including certain public members of the public.
I mean, when it comes to financial sustainability, certainly with commercial media, we talk about competition and all that kind of stuff. Do you feel that we are entering more phase where a cooperation between newsrooms is more important, particularly when one thinks about the public interest? I mean, it really does happen, for instance, with sort of the Daily Maverick and News 24 or Ground Up making its reporting open, Creative Commons license, republishable. Um, is it a new phase? Do you think cooperation or collaboration is one way, at least, to ensure the public interest of journalism's objective survives?
Yeah, even if it's not necessarily a new face, I think it is being valued more. That's one of the things we found in our research. People were saying there's need for more collaboration. There's value for collaboration with each other, whether it's with investigative pieces and other different forms of work, but also collaboration with other sectors, which comes back to the idea of public interest media being a group effort and not just seen as something that this newsroom has to financially sustain themselves. So we can't, if it's public, then it has to be all the different members of the public participating, and there is certainly a lot more value placed on collaborations between different sectors and different media houses.
Glenda, if I might just quickly leap back to you, because Mama Ponya, this issue of structural funding of some sort. I mean, one of the clear things clearly is that you would need institutions like the AIP to ensure the transparency of the disbursement of the funds. If you're taking money from the Special Investigative Unit as proceeds that they manage to seize as a result of reporting, Mama Ponya suggests you could take a percentage of that and fund journalism. As the Secretary General of SANIF, do you believe that the good job that the structures are doing, the SANIF, the Press Council, the NAB, the AIP, they're doing good work. But do you believe they're sufficient, doing the right kind of work for the future of journalism? If we're talking about the diversity of journalism, the new kinds of funding, or do you think there's quite a bit of adaptation that needs to happen there too, alongside journalists, newsrooms adapting? Is there more work to be done there, do you think?
I think so, Alan. I think the work of collaboration is important, but it could also end up being consolidation because competition is also important. So if you're seeing a story on this platform, on this news organization, then you're reading the same thing on another and the same thing on another. I actually think that's a bit of a problem too. But in terms of the organizations we have in South Africa, I must say we're very lucky to have such a robust civil society. I mean, we're all part of civil society in this era to try and make a difference. The kind of work that SANIF's doing with getting the Competition Commission to act on our behalf with the big techs is important, because I don't actually believe it sounds arrogant to say 100 million handout and the problem solved. Well, it's not going to be solved with a handout here to keep people quiet and another handout there. There needs to be a more sustainable solution. And the variety of options that are coming through are what people are saying is the right thing right now. But, you know, as Amelia was saying, Daily Maverick did try all those different options, the donor model, this model, that model, you know, a whole lot of different variety of ways in which to sustain, and it's still not enough. So I'm saying we've been grappling with the same thing for more than a decade now. I don't think there's any plain and simple, nor is there one answer to the problem. Definitely not. But I think where there's a wake-up call that needs to happen, not just from the way the SANEVs and the press councils look at the thing, just from a mainstream gaze, not just from that, but very much from communities and the publics and the reading publics out there. There needs to be a little bit more of a shake-up and a wake-up call, because it's like they are consuming information all the time, everywhere. Everywhere you go, whether it's a bus station, people are on their phones consuming media. No, not newspapers anymore, I'm afraid to say. It's and even not mainstream television news. They're consuming news on their smartphones, and not getting the point that journalists have a big role to play in this. Not the only role to play in it, but a big role to play in it. And I don't think communities are getting it. And I don't know how one gets out there to all the millions of people to say journalism needs to be sustained and we need your support. And it's also hard to do that when there's so many millions of people unemployed in South Africa and needing to put literally bread on the table. So it's a huge conundrum. They do want their data, they do get their data, but then the next thing also is we need to buy bread and milk. So who's going to come out and say 100 Rand a month to this and 100 Rand a month to that? I don't know if that's going to happen.
I mean, Mama Ponya also raised the issue of the public's perception of journalism. So that's an additional of journalists. It's an additional kind of problem in the whole matrix of problems we're dealing with. And it doesn't help if political leaders are negative about journalists. Most recently, we saw that at the MK Party rally during the elections. Kanita, as an experienced journalist, you wrote an article on covering the elections, the recent elections for journalists, and some of the challenges that they faced. I mean, you mentioned that many of the attacks were online, or most were online, compared to journalists out on assignment and reporting in the field. Can you elaborate on some of your observations that you made?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you for this incredible work. The State of the Newsroom is a very, very sobering analysis of where we are in the media. I just wonder if you can indulge me, take a little bit a step back to the conversation you've been having with the other panelists about this kind of separation between mainstream, kind of new media, etc. I had the weirdest experience covering the election from three dynamics, right? So I was writing columns for News 24, which is premium South Africa's top digital news organization. I was writing articles for Al Jazeera, which is international. And then I was working full-time developing a social startup called Seen South Africa, right? And I realized I learned many lessons in that period, in that 3-month period. And I think that we're not really ready to unpack the fact that we cannot look at these kind of, this is the mainstream, this is how we do it, this is this new scary thing, we don't really know how things are done there. And I found it quite fascinating to see, to toggle between these different spaces, right? I've obviously been in mainstream media for 13 years and coming to a space where there's no rules apply, But at the heart of all three, right, is sustainability, number one. Number two, media ethics is a feature that you can't strip away from any of those three platforms. And the third thing is the fundamental realization that user behavior has completely changed and that the only winner is big tech. That as much as people innovate and, okay, we all need to pivot to TikTok and everybody needs to do.
She may have lost her connectivity right now. Perhaps while we wait for her, I mean, one of the issues she does raise, and if she comes back, please let me know, is disinformation in election times. And I wish I could have heard more about what she was going to say about those different spaces. But we have touched a little bit on that, the new environment and the shaping of democracy with disinformation. I see there's a question around AI in the newsrooms. That's not quite around disinformation, which of course does use more and more is using AI. But do any of you, it's kind of an unexplored area right now, but the use of AI in newsrooms. Does anyone have any view on that? And particularly when we are talking about public interest journalism, does it matter if AI more frequently starts to write our articles that we read? Anthea, what is your thought? Are you going to be out of a job soon?
Oh, golly. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing was that last year, when we did, when ChatGPT really sort of hit, we got at least a quarter of the exam essays that I marked were generated by, you know, quite a clunky first version of AI. And then I tried something slightly different this year. I said to students, look, you know, the purpose of coming to a university is to learn how to use your brain and to think. If you outsource that thinking to a machine, I'd read this lovely sort of parallel, which was that, you know, if you want to be a top class athlete, you want to be an Olympic athlete, and your trainer says to you, you have to do weights in order to build your muscle strength. And what you do is you go and hire somebody else who does the weight training for you, and then you turn up on the track, you know. So I was using this kind of analogy. What we are doing is kind of weight training for the brain. You have to you have to do the work. So in this exam, it was so interesting to me. I said to students, I'm going to penalize you heavily for AI use because I don't want beautiful writing. What I want to see on the page how you are grappling with ideas and concepts. Mm-hmm. And what I got was a sort of very high proportion of people who took that seriously and were doing the kind of grappling, you know, on the page. So we had less AI use this year, and the instruments that track it have got better, although the instruments that undo the tracking have got better. You know, it's like warfare. Mm. But so I grapple with that, you know, because I think AI in academic use is different from AI in, say, newsroom use. And I think that's something, you know, I immediately saw that question about AI and thought, oh yeah, this is going to have to be on your agenda for the State of the Newsroom report for next year, is a really thorough engagement with it and figure out how it's working and what are people doing with it. I don't think we in academic environments have a good grip yet, because we're teaching students to do certain kinds of things, you know, concepts and ideas and practices and skills and all these things. And we want them to do it, you know, like playing in a sandpit. Get your hands dirty, because otherwise it's not going to work as education. But education is a different thing from production, you know, where you're streamlining processes and so on. So I can see that these two things are different. What I haven't quite got my hand on yet is, as a practice teacher inside an educational space, is how to understand exactly what's going on in the newsroom, or, you know, the actual world practice environment, so that we can kind of go, those things are now useful to, you know, pull across here. So I think we're still while we're all fiddling with these things, you know, and every time we have a staff meeting, somebody goes, oh, have you tried such and such? I discovered there was a thing called Claude in the last 2 weeks, you know. So, you know, and I think it's terribly important. Actually, I think it's extremely important for anybody who's working in media or working in education of media, that we ourselves are experimenting with these things, figuring out what exactly it is they do. But I think there is a gap. There's a gap between us in an educational environment, understanding what people in practice environments are actually doing, and then being able to sort of translate, back here and maybe ask some questions there and so on. So, it feels uncertain to me, and I feel uncertain. I feel like I've got to do a lot of work myself.
Thanks, Anthea. Juanita, I see you're back.
Sorry, I had a load shedding.
Yeah, I went into the question of disinformation, and that's how we got to the question of AI. But you were talking about working in multiple spaces before your power cut.
So the point that I was making is that you have consistent streams that affect, whichever space that you're in. So the first is obviously the sustainability thread, right? Nobody has really made sustainable income from social video, or Al Jazeera battling financial considerations too, being one of the largest international platforms in the world. And so there's that stream. The second stream is when it comes to the threats against journalists and what are the challenges that journalists face in 2024. Now, what I found in writing this piece for State of the Nation is that there has been a change in how journalists are intimidated. Firstly, there is a realization that not all journalists can physically go to events, go and dig themselves, go to press conference. There's a reliance on political parties, for example, in an election cycle for news. It's just too expensive to send your own cameras, right? For example. And so the idea then is to say, how is a journalist affected in this new environment? And there are a lot more, because threats are online. Cyber harassment absolutely blew up, and we've seen in this report of State of the Nation and many reports done by the Wits Journalism School that cyber misogyny is a real direct threat to journalists, right? And so this resource thread that you guys are speaking about almost plays its way in the media freedom and harassment against journalists thread, because you see threats online. You see most of the 10 journalists at the Media Monitoring Africa, they had a tool where they monitored online harassment. Most of them were women. I was one of them, and so you see the level in which how people intimidate journalists, and essentially you no longer need to go with a gun and send, an Inkabi who's covered in a balaclava to a journalist's house in 2024. All you need to do is have sustained harassment against a journalist, and she just simply won't write about X political party. And then you saw some worrying trends about how the MK party and Zuma supporters treated journalists during the election coverage. And then finally, the misinformation and the disinformation that you saw, I think, was rooted in the fact that political parties use that quite as in their arsenal to just spread misinformation. A lot of the editors that I spoke to were really concerned about how they have an added layer of work now when it comes to the era of deepfakes and the era of artificial intelligence, where you can't just accept things because it's recorded on video, if someone's sending you a voice note, etc. So there's sort of an added responsibility, an added layer of fact-checking in the journalistic process. But just finally to say, Alan, that I think that the resilience of South African media was really, really shown in this year's election. There was an enormous effort to undermine the outcome of the elections and to create social discord, I think, by some political parties. And the fact that the media, held power accountable to the point that the elections agency in South Africa, the IEC, said, we couldn't have done our work without the role of the media because of the heightened level of misinformation. There was an incident during the results process where the results boards shut down for a few seconds or a few minutes, and the amount of misinformation that spread in that time about the credibility of the elections was enormous and could have led to the undermining of the entire election results had it not been for professional journalists who sought to debunk this misinformation that was spreading like wildfire at the time. So if there's three things that I pulled out in terms of covering this election, the first is resources and media financial sustainability is a huge concern, and we saw the real consequences of it in this election coverage. Secondly, it's never been easier to intimidate a journalist, and we are feeling the consequence of it. And the third is South African media has shown extreme resilience, but like any situation, we cannot rely on that resilience because more and more journalists are falling out of the industry because of intimidation, because of burnout, and more importantly, because of bad mental health.
If you permit me, I mean, it's, we read a lot of reports around online harassment of particular journalists. You say you were one of them. I mean, concretely, what's that like? Do you wake up with like 100 sort of messages on your WhatsApp, derogatory messages and so on? I mean, what is that experience like about being harassed when you are targeted?
Yeah. Alan, I've spoken really publicly about my journey with burnout. It's a very public thing where I had exited formal journalism earlier this year just to kind of recuperate. It took me something like 6 months to just deal with the sustained years of harassment, of online bullying, of fat shaming, of every time a story is written, the level of harassment is just insane. And again, I say that with the cognizance that, number one, I'm probably not the most trolled journalist in South Africa. There are colleagues like Karen Moore and Polly van Wyk who face a lot more harassment than I do. Secondly, that I always had the support of really, really efficient newsrooms and editors all along the way. So I don't know what it must be like for a reporter reporting on a municipality in rural KwaZulu-Natal who does not have the support but faces these targeted harassment. And so the idea then is, for me, I thought, let me step back to understand the genesis of it and to use my experience as a teaching moment for other journalists. And I realized in this time of a lot of deep research is that there has to be a huge focus, and when you're talking about training new journalists, Anthea, about social media hygiene and how we interact with our audiences, and how, for example, X or formerly Twitter has become your abuser, and therefore its role as an aid or an assistant in disseminating your journalism is diminishing with time, because all it serves is not a true pulse of what's happening in the world, but actually a distorted cesspool of abuse and cyber harassment. And so these are conversations that need to be had now, especially we kind of have the election as a benchmark to say how much of a good actually have come from these platforms. If these are the platforms that are, number one, cannibalizing our industry, and number two, not a true and accurate gauge of what the public's, as Glenda said, is. And so if what we are doing is every day sending journalists or exposing ourselves to the lion's den, and the proverbial lion's den reaches you when you're in the safety of your home, when you're in a newsroom, when you are in anywhere in the world, because of the sustained way of how journalists face these attacks. You see it happening with journalists in Palestine. You're seeing it happening with journalists in Mozambique at the moment, where you don't have to put a journalist in jail anymore. You just have to target them to the point that they voluntarily stop in their tracks or just walk away as a result of burnout. So when we talk about these ideas, these are not abstract consequences. These affect the overall media freedom initiative. And when you see this decline in how many journalists are left in South African media, the report points out quite clearly, Alan, you realize that all of this compounded has a very tangible consequence.
Absolutely. Thanks, Juanita. I see there are a couple of questions around the public image of journalists and the political economy of the media. In other words, ownership, obviously, ownership perpetuating various perspectives. What is your take on either of those questions, Juanita? The political economy of the media obviously is a question, and Mama Ponya earlier spoke about whose interests are journalists reporting on. You have a publication like Ground Up that is trying to do journalism from a human rights perspective and doing quite a good job, I think. What is your take about around those issues? I guess when you're doing the job of journalism, perhaps anyway, what is your view? Do these things come up in the newsroom?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are two elements to it. The first element is that there is something fundamentally flawed around media proprietors wanting to extract and not reinvest in journalism. And I think that I was very lucky to work in a newsroom where they understood that you could only grow a paywall if you invest in journalism. And that investment in journalism paid off profoundly. And you saw it, even the SABC, if there was a colleague from the SABC in future discussions will reflect on this, that they had, positive success in the election coverage because linked to the amount of kind of resources that were invested in good journalism. The second thing that we need to bear in mind when we lament about the state of the media is that there's a lot of bad journalism that's happening and that's people are getting away with. And if you look at some of the coverage of journalism, of the elections rather, it's simply inadequate to tell people what they saw on TV or on social media yesterday. It is simply inadequate. And so lazy journalism is also contributing to this decline. And so when the public sort of comes and says, the trust, because that's what traditional media gave, was this kind of benchmark of trust. Anything you saw in the Sunday Times or anything you saw in the Star newspaper was factually accurate and was of the most important thing that I need to know. Now an algorithm decides that for you. The other point that I want to make is that with the overemphasis on news influencers and the social media scene, at the end of the day, all of that space, I played in that space for 6 months to understand it, to get a good sense of what it is. It's all reliant on journalism. If News 24 didn't send a reporter to that EFF march, that Darren Camphor, whoever influencer that has 200,000 followers on Instagram, on TikTok, would not be able to do that media commentary. They are not actually going out and getting news. Similarly, visuals from Newsroom Africa are used by these people who have large followings. So the baseline still exists. That's not something that we have to debate. So the question is, if there's value in news, how can the people who are already doing it do it better? And how can they learn from user behavior? Because essentially what we are doing in mainstream media, we are saying, no, we refuse to adapt to the style in which people want to consume the news. So other people are just taking what you are dishing out on a platform where not many people are and repackaging it for what the audience wants, into shorter clips, into social video, into getting, you are essentially competing in the attention economy. And traditional media says, oh no, we don't want to compete in the attention economy. We are great, we are trusted. You come and find us at 33 Rand a paper on a Sunday. Doesn't work like that anymore. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bemoan and bemoan and bemoan every year until the industry shrinks, until we kind of understand that it's not us versus them. It's how has the user evolved? If you gauge your own consumption of media, 80% of what I consume regarding the conflict in the Middle East comes from social media platforms, Instagram and TikTok. And I am a huge consumer of news. I pay for news. I pay for paywalls. I have subscriptions to at least 8 news publications, and yet most of my news consumption is social media platforms. What does that tell you about the average South African or average news consumer? And so I think that this kind of binaries of traditional fighting their way to do the same thing when the audience has said we don't want it that way, versus the new media who says none of the rules apply, we'll do everything how we can, we'll plagiarize when we plagiarize, we'll fabricate when we need to fabricate, because that's what's getting us an audience. So it's kind of this trust versus attention economy, which is just getting us to a point of extreme misinformation and disinformation, which is fundamentally, we all can agree, really bad for democracy.
I mean, that's a central point that's coming out through all of the guests here today. Your point around being a formal news subscriber, but still getting most of your information, whether true, false, whatever the case may be, on your the more social media feeds, is a fascinating one. You might not have thought about that, but just the point about AI in the newsrooms came up. I mean, have you seen that? Do you see a future of AI being used in more formal newsrooms?
I think we already use it, and I think you know, I would love to have more discussions around this in terms of the efficiencies that AI tools really empower journalists. The fact that you have apps that essentially pre-edit video, so you can actually file video, quality video from the field in a way that, you know, AI literally transcribes for you. So transcription, editing. These are tools that journalists already use. So we must not kind of look at AI in the construct of generative AI alone, where it kind of just makes up a story and you know, you cut out the journalist. But actually engaging with technology in a way to empower us, because yes, there are consequences to it, and obviously there's been a lot of talk about guidelines, but the room for enhancement, the room for taking a TV script and enhancing it in real time, or preparing journalists, you know, for live crossings, when, you know, you're used to a world where journalists mumble for 40 seconds, when AI can actually empower the journalist to be ready with a script, for example. So they are amazing tools, transcription tools, efficiency tools, video editing tools, sound editing tools, that all rely on artificial intelligence. And I think that we need to come together. You know, things like CapCut. Journalists need to know how to, you don't have to be a video editor employed at the SABC to know how to cut video in real time, to understand, to use AI-enabled apps to basically respond to the need of the time. And the need of the time is what? Quicker, shorter, and faster and shorter, basically. That's the kind of space that we're going in. Or when you kind of do the lean back journalism, that's your more longer, etc. And so the role of a journalist today has completely morphed, that you are the graphic designer. You extract the data and you throw it into Canva, and it gives you beautiful graphics. You then take your clips and you throw it into CapCut and you play around with it, and you come up with a beautiful video to support your journalism. Similarly, what you do is the press conference that you went to for 2 hours, the time of going back with your little recorder and listening it back to 2 hours and transcribing for 4 hours is completely redundant. You throw it into Slack, it will spit out a pretty accurate transcription in under 40 seconds. And so there are ways to empower the new journalist if we can come up with a baseline for what actually is this efficient, ethical new journalist, and what are the tools that will enable this new journalism.
I see thanks very much, Konita. I mean, as Anthea suggested, this is clearly an interesting focus area that perhaps we could actually explore in State of the Newsroom. I see we are up with time, but I wanted to give each of you just a chance to sort of to give a sense of what you think the journalism is looking like in the, I suppose, immediate or near future in South Africa, whether structures or whether the kind of journalist that emerges. Glenda, yourself, What do you think? What do you make of the future of journalism in South Africa?
I think because we've got a strong tradition of investigative journalism, that's our strength here. I think we must build upon it. And I don't think that's going to die anytime soon. I think the investigative tradition is rooted in the culture of the democratic tradition. And I think it'll actually grow because it's actually known worldwide, actually. And I mean, just because I am from Sanev, I don't want to sing Sanev's praises, but Sanev's also known internationally. It's got a huge brand. So people do take us seriously in terms of wanting to protect the independence of journalism and the ethical nature of journalism. So I'm not feeling too pessimistic, to be honest.
And here we have Glenda's feeling positive. How are you feeling?
I said not too pessimistic. I didn't say positive.
Sorry, did I change your comment?
Yeah. I suppose I sort of feel it's a pretty exciting time to be navigating, but it demands of us to be extremely clever, and extremely thoughtful about how we take the steps into the future. I think there is no doubt, that South African journalism really is a powerful force and has been very, very, very important for us as a nation, and in sidestepping disaster in many cases. And we can never forget that. We can never forget it's sort of like solid old thorough journalism that rescued us at several points. And as Glenda says, we have some strong institutions. But I do think that we need to be cleverer about how we tackle some of the problems. So you asked Glenda at the beginning of this thing, what struck her? What struck me was Media 24 saying that they'd lost 95% of the revenue on the News 24 site to Google. That's a problem that's got to be tackled with some very, very clever thinking. It cannot be that your very vehicle is giving away 95% of its revenue to a great big sucky enterprise from another part of the world, So, the AI thing is going to challenge us to be very smart. But the financial sustainability, I don't think we've quite yet got to the point where we really understand what could be a clever way forward. And I think these kind of calls to the government, to kind of help us out. I think the work is ours to start thinking much more cleverly about what we do. I have faith. I do have faith that we could do some very clever work together.
Thank you. Mama Ponya, what's your view of the immediate future or the future of the journalist space in South Africa?
So in my response, can I also just refer to some of the questions that were posts or some of the comments.
Please do.
The one about public perception and the one about ownership. And I think in my response, I would really say that I think the media needs to listen more. I think there is, to a large extent, a disconnect between us. I think sometimes as journalists, we live in echo chambers. We have the same conversations, we move in the same circles, and we begin to live in these echo chambers and begin to move away really from the reality of the people. And I think that's happening. And that's why if you were to look at mainstream coverage of elections and who was given a voice and who was expected to do well and who actually did well, you will see that disconnect between what people are feeling and wanting and what media is covering and who is giving a voice. And it goes back to also the issue of ownership as well, like whose interests are we serving? So I think we need to listen better, and we need to be more relevant and more connected to the masses of our people, I think we are losing that connection and just serving a minority. But we really need to, especially mainstream media, because it is well resourced as compared to the local media. Mainstream media is well resourced and therefore really has to connect to those people and connect to what people really want to hear and what stories people really want to engage, and not impose what we think is right and what we think people should be thinking, but tell stories as they are. And I think that's part of how we get people to start wanting to be part of what we're doing. We get people to value journalists and journalism is when they start seeing overall themselves being reflected. And I think right now we're not listening very well, and we're seeing less and less of that because we are so stuck in our echo chamber. So I think we really do need to start listening and respecting the majority of the people instead of projecting what we think democracy should look like and what we think is right and what they should be listening to.
Thank you, Mama Ponya. Kanita, a final word from you?
I'm excited, Alan. I'm excited for the next year. I think that there are huge opportunities to innovate, to do better, to actually change the game in many ways. And I think if we ever have to have this conversation in a year's time, we'll be talking about a very, very, very different landscape. I think that the evolution is happening much more rapid than we think. And I do think that we need to just buckle up.
That's an interesting final point about the pace of change. We have run out of time. Yaya, I saw you put your hand up, but hopefully your questions were answered that you put in the Q&A chat. A couple of guests did deal with that, and we unfortunately are out of time. But thank you to Anthea, Glenda, Mama Ponya, and Juanita for your time. I'd also like to thank Dinesh Balia, the director at the Wits Centre for Journalism, Leslie Cowling, who did the proofreading for this issue, the accounts-people at the centre, Pierre McCarney for processing invoices and doing all that behind-the-scenes work, Wild Tiger for the layout, Stuart for helping with this webinar, and Ground Up for the open use of their photographs, which we find very useful when producing State of the Newsroom. I see Stuart put the link to the State of the Newsroom in the chat. You can also download it at that website, journalism.co.za. And with that, thanks once again to my guests, and goodbye for now.